Cora Crippen's friends were indignant. She had returned to the US suddenly in February 1910, and just a few weeks afterwards had become ill and died there. And her husband, Hawley Harvey Crippen, far from mourning his late wife, was quite openly flaunting his relationship with his secretary, Ethel Le Neve. On the 20th of February, the couple was seen at a charity dinner and dance, and Ethel was wearing Cora's diamond rings and other expensive jewellery. An obituary for Cora had been placed in the musical theatre publication, The Era, but Crippen's conduct was the main source of gossip amongst her friends. Of course, Crippen's affair with his secretary had been known of for a few years in February 1910. Cora may have known of it too, but as she conducted many affairs of her own, presumably there was something of a tacit understanding on the matter. Nevertheless, the suddenness of Cora's disappearance and subsequent death in the United States would inevitably cause gossip amongst her friends, and the appearance of Ethel Le Neve so swiftly upon the scene would naturally give rise to darker suspicions. Cora had been a flamboyant and hospitable figure in the world of London musical theatre, and although her stage career as Belle Elmore had never amounted to much, her charitable work and generous society accorded her a certain status amongst her circle of friends. She had an array of expensive, fashionable dresses, and her jewellery was much admired. And all in all, she lived far beyond the means that Dr Crippen's modest salary could afford. She, like her husband, was American, and that undoubtedly gave them a certain cachet in Edwardian London. It was well known that she thoroughly dominated her mild and obliging husband, that she spent the money he earned as a homeopathic doctor and dentist quite freely, and that she often publicly upbraided Crippen for any fault she perceived in him. She had scolded Crippen at a dinner they had given us home for her friends the Martinettis on the 31st of January, which was the last occasion on which Cora had been seen, and Crippen had, as always, accepted this meekly. It was small wonder, really, that Crippen took solace in the equally quiet and demure Ethel Le Neve, to whom he was much better suited, and who seemed to be a contrast with the loud and ostentatious Cora Crippen in every way. In early March, Ethel moved into 39 Hilldrop Crescent, Camden, which had been the Crippens' home, and this gave rise to an intensification in chatter amongst Cora's musical theatre friends. It is difficult to say at which point gossip became suspicion, but it is clear that Cora's friends were openly voicing their suspicions by the spring of 1910, and that each fresh sighting of Dr Crippen and his companion, wearing Cora's clothes and jewellery, gave further impetus to these suspicions. In any case, on the 30th of June, it had reached a tipping point from talk to action, because John Nash, the husband of one of Cora Crippen's friends, visited Scotland Yard and raised the matter with the Superintendent first. He passed the matter to Inspector Dew to examine, and a week later Dew commenced inquiries. He paid a visit to Dr Crippen on Friday the 8th of July. Crippen struck him as open and helpful, and he found nothing of which he could be suspicious. Crippen confessed to him that the story of Cora's return to the US was untrue. In fact, he admitted he was acutely embarrassed that his wife had run off with another man named Bruce Miller, and the story of her return to the US and subsequent death had been a cover he had invented. Inspector Dew took a long statement from Crippen in his dental practice at Albion House, and the two even had lunch together at the Holborn restaurant. Crippen took him to their house, and Dew looked around, but saw nothing suspicious. He was preparing to wrap up the matter and write a report to close the case, when he returned to Crippen's office to clarify a couple of points on Monday, the 11th of July, only to be told that Crippen had gone away suddenly. Dew's suspicions were thoroughly aroused, and he returned to 39 Hilldrop Crescent to conduct another search of the house. The garden was dug up, and the house searched again, but to no avail. There were no signs that anything was amiss. But Dew was restless over the matter of Crippen and Le Neve's sudden departure, and he returned on Tuesday and searched the house from top to bottom, including the coal cellar, and still found nothing. However, he remained unsettled by the matter, and he returned again on the 13th of July, paying particular attention on this occasion to the coal cellar. He noticed a brick in the cellar floor was loose, and he succeeded in dislodging it with the aid of a poker. He loosened several more until he had revealed an area of earth, and then he began to dig. Several inches below the surface he discovered a mass of rotting flesh. A full excavation was undertaken, and tests revealed the flesh to be human. A murder investigation was opened, and on the 16th of July a warrant was issued for the arrest of Hawley Harvey Crippen and Ethel Le Neve. Ethel Le Neve was born in Diss, Norfolk, in 1883. She had gone to work for Crippen in 1900 at the age of 17 as a typist and secretary, and although Crippen was then 38 years old, the two became close, and around 1905 or 1906 they became lovers. Of course, Crippen was married at that time to the flamboyant and demanding Cora Crippen, or Belle Elmore, as she called herself on stage, and whose real name was Kunigund Makamotsky. But as his affections for Cora declined, so his admiration for the reserved and gentle Miss Le Neve increased. There is no doubt she became his refuge from Cora, and the two often talked of marriage, and, according to Miss Le Neve, hoped that Cora might return to the US at some point. Ethel became pregnant and suffered a miscarriage during the 4 or 5 years of their relationship, and it seems she was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with her status as Crippen's mistress, because she had begun seeing another man, and this had caused Crippen to become extremely jealous. After Cora's sudden departure, supposedly to return to the US, and her death thereafter, things had improved a great deal for Ethel. She had quickly been given possession of Cora's jewellery, and had then moved in with Crippen. The two were living as man and wife by the time of the police investigation in June and July of 1910. It is not known what happened after Inspector Dew's interview with Crippen on the 8th of July, which caused him and Ethel to flee, but it is thought that Ethel panicked, and that Crippen was concerned that Ethel's nerve would not withstand police questioning. This seems plausible, as Ethel was much more timid in her subsequent interactions than Crippen, who was always at pains to protect her. The day after Inspector Dew's interview, on the 9th or possibly 10th of July, they had packed and left, caught the ferry from Dover, and travelled to Rotterdam and then to Antwerp, where they awaited a passage to Canada. They saw the news of the grisly discoveries unfolding at 39 Hilldrop Crescent, and realized they were in great peril. Le Neve cut her hair and dressed as a boy, while Crippen removed his customary glasses and grew a beard. They called themselves Mr. and Master Robinson, father and son, who were travelling to Canada for the son's health. Meanwhile, wanted posters were placed around England, and ports were being watched for signs of Crippen and Le Neve. Investigations revealed that the body in the coal cellar consisted only of a torso, and no signs of the limbs or head could be found. Also, a Home Office scientist, William Wilcox, ascertained that there were large quantities of hyoscine in the body, which, it was believed, was the cause of death. A piece of scar tissue led to the identification of the torso as being that of Cora Crippen, and the reports on the police investigation made headline news in England. These reports were avidly read by an enthralled public, and the search for Crippen received international coverage also. On the 20th of July, Crippen and Le Neve boarded the SS Montrose, bound for Quebec, Canada. The passage would take 11 days, and they probably should have travelled third class, which would have made them less noticeable. but as saloon passengers they were naturally brought into contact with the ship's officers. The captain, Henry George Kendall, had read the account of Crippen and Le Neve's flight from London on the eve of his sailing from Antwerp, and he became suspicious of Master Robinson's femininity of appearance, his voice and walk. He suspected that he was in fact a she. He took every opportunity to observe the father and son, and found their mutual affection also suspicious. At last he concluded that the pair were a man and a woman, and that his two passengers were Crippen and Le Neve. Wireless telegraphy was still in its infancy in 1910, and although equipped with the capability to transmit telegraph messages to shore, soon the SS Montrose would be out of telegraph range of land. The captain therefore decided, 2 days out at sea, to send a signal to shore. It read, "Have strong suspicions that Crippen, London cellar murderer, and accomplice are among saloon passengers. Moustache taken off, growing beard. Accomplice dressed as a boy. Manner and build undoubtedly a girl." This message was relayed to Scotland Yard, and Inspector Dew, along with 2 other officers, caught a fast boat to Quebec. They arrived before the SS Montrose and went out to meet the ship with the pilot. Crippen and Le Neve were asked if they would like to meet the pilot as he came aboard, and they agreed. Inspector Dew came aboard and said, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. Do you know me? I'm Inspector Dew from Scotland Yard." Crippen replied, "Thank God it's all over. The suspense has been too great. I couldn't stand it any longer." Le Neve was faint and clung to Crippen. She made a statement and said she knew nothing about the matter at all. Crippen from the outset declared to police that Le Neve had known nothing of the matter, and he never varied from this position. Extradition proceedings were a formality, because Canada at that time was a colony of Britain, and Crippen and Le Neve were returned to England aboard the SS Megantic. News of their capture and their extraordinary flight in disguise became international news and thrilled newspaper readers. They were greeted on their arrival at Liverpool by huge crowds who wished to catch a glimpse of the fugitives. They appeared together at Bow Street Magistrates' Court, and Crippen was charged with the murder of Cora Crippen. He continued to deny any involvement whatever of Ethel Le Neve, and she also denied any knowledge of the matter. But she was nevertheless charged as an accessory to murder. In other words, she had known of the crime and helped aid a fugitive. There was no suggestion that there was any evidence to implicate her in the murder itself, though. Crippen's defence was that the body found in the coal cellar was not that of Cora Crippen, and that it must relate to a previous occupant of 39 Hilldrop Avenue. The prosecution, however, showed that a fragment of clothing was from a pyjama top that belonged to Crippen, and that these pyjamas were a gift from Cora in 1909, and from a label on the garment that it had not been manufactured prior to 1908. This meant that the pyjamas had been buried in the coal cellar during the past 2 years and during the Crippens' tenure in the house. The scar tissue extracted by Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the noted pathologist, was taken as positive identification of Cora Crippen, as it corresponded to a hernia scar she was known to have had, although the defence tried to argue that it was simply a fold of tissue. Apart from the forensic evidence, the trial was unremarkable. The prosecution gave Crippen's motive for committing the murder as being his desire to marry Miss Le Neve, and that the murder of his wife had been his means of accomplishing this. Crippen was found guilty and condemned to death for the murder of his wife. Ethel Le Neve was charged as an accessory in the murder, and her trial began on the 25th of October, 3 days after Crippen was sentenced to death. She made a statement to the court in which she denied any knowledge of the death of Cora, that she had regarded her as a friend, that she had indeed been in a relationship with Crippen, and that their flight to Canada in disguise, was motivated by a desire to avoid social scandal. The jury found her not guilty in 22 minutes, and she was cleared. The trial left Le Neve free, but her lover had been condemned to death. She visited Crippen in Pentonville prison every day, where he awaited his execution, and the two exchanged letters. Crippen's letters never failed to show his every consideration for Ethel and his devotion to her. The two continued their intense and now painful relationship until the very end. Crippen bequeathed all his possessions to Ethel in his final will, and Ethel visited him for the final time on the 22nd of November, only hours before he was due to be executed. Their feelings as they made their farewells on that final occasion can only be imagined. In his final letter to Ethel Le Neve, Crippen wrote, "How to control myself to write I hardly know, but pray to God to help us to be brave, to face the end now so near. Time is short now, and there is so much to say. The governor brought me the dreadful news that there would be no reprieve, about 10 o'clock. He was so kind and considerate in telling me, in breaking the shock as gently as he could. He was most kind, and left me at last with, 'God bless you. Good night.' When he had gone, I kissed your face in the photo, my faithful, devoted companion in all this sorrow. Oh, how glad I was I had the photo. It was some consolation, although in spite of all my greatest efforts, it was impossible to keep down a great sob." Harvey Crippen's love for Ethel Le Neve and hers for him is one of the fascinating features of this case. It surely represents one of the world's great love stories, but it also exhibits a degree of selfishness and gruesomeness which has marked it out as Britain's most famous case. Throughout his questioning by police, during his trial for his life, and while awaiting execution, Crippen's sole concern was for Ethel. The prison staff and governor, and all who came into contact with Crippen, were well disposed towards him. His gentleness and amiability impressed everyone he met. On the evening before his execution, on the 22nd of November 1910, Crippen was visited by the governor of Pentonville Jail, who handed him a last-minute telegram from Ethel, saying farewell, and he broke down. The governor asked him if there was anything he could do for him, and Crippen requested that he be buried on the final day, with a photo of Ethel and her letters to him. The governor gave him his promise that he would see that this was done. During this period awaiting Crippen's execution, Ethel wrote a pamphlet on her life and flight with Crippen, which was really an extension of her defense statement and gives little away. It was ghost-written for her and serialized in the papers. She maintained a wide-eyed innocence in it, as she had always done, and adhered to the story which she and Crippen never strayed from. Crippen was hanged at 9 a.m. the following morning. He was buried in the prison yard, and in fulfillment of his promise to Crippen, the governor placed Edith's photo and letters in his grave. When Filson Young wrote his monograph on Hawley Harvey Crippen for Great British Trials in 1920, he included 4 possible motives for Crippen's killing Cora Crippen in 1910. These were, firstly, because she was threatening to leave him and take all her money and jewels with her. Secondly, because he had accidentally poisoned her with hyoscine, which he had administered as a sedative to dampen her ardour. Thirdly, that he murdered her simply to be rid of her, and thus make way for his true love, which was the prosecution's case. And the fourth reason he declined to give or discuss. He simply wrote, "The only other theory with which the facts may be brought into accordance is one which would involve the collusion of an accomplice, and for obvious reasons cannot be discussed. Those obvious reasons are, of course, the consideration of the role played by Ethel Le Neve, both in commissioning the murder of Cora Crippen and in its execution. The reason this could not be considered was because Ethel Le Neve was very much alive and had been found not guilty in a court of law. In 2019, we may do what Filson Young could not publicly do 100 years ago: consider the involvement of Ethel Le Neve in the killing of Cora Crippen. There are many reasons for supposing that Le Neve had a far greater involvement in the murder than she or Crippen ever admitted. She had known both Crippen and his wife for 10 years prior to the crime. It is inconceivable that she should have believed that Cora had simply returned to the US and that she had left her clothes and jewelry behind her. After she had disappeared, she told police she had gone to Hilltop Crescent to tidy up. She could not have failed to notice that not only were Cora's clothes and jewels still present in the house, but that all her essential items had been left behind. It is not something anyone could reasonably believe, even if they possessed a strong motivation, as she did, to believe what they were told. Cora Crippen could not have gone anywhere, given that she appeared to have taken nothing with her. One of the features of the case was that Crippen had dissected the body with some precision and expertise. It has been speculated that he deposited the head in the sea as he crossed over to Dieppe with Le Neve. It has also been assumed that he carried out this gruesome operation in the bath. This would not, it has been attested, be a simple job, and it would have taken several days to accomplish it. Ethel was present at the house throughout this period on a daily basis, and it is inevitable that she would have been privy to at least some, if not all, of this. It seems likely, in fact, that she had a role in cleaning up the inevitable mess, which would have been considerable. Evidence was gleaned by Professor William Wright that Ethel Le Neve was studying poisons in the months before the murder at the Royal College of Surgeons, but he was not called to give evidence at her trial. If true, it suggests that she and Crippen were discussing more than simply a hope that Cora should disappear, but actively considering the means by which this might be accomplished. Crippen was extremely calm when interviewed by Inspector Dew at the outset of the police inquiries. He even lunched with Dew, and Dew was preparing to file a report which would advise no further action in the case. Yet the following day, Crippen and Le Neve had fled. What had changed? It seems straightforward and credible to suppose that Ethel was not so calm as Crippen, that when he reported the matter of the police investigation to her, she was panicked by it. For his part, he knew immediately that she would be unable to withstand a police grilling. The decision to flee was taken that evening, therefore, immediately following his interview with Inspector Dew. But why would Ethel Le Neve be panicked if she knew nothing of the matter, as she has always claimed? The explanation given for the flight to America is not credible. She was not afraid of scandal, and their affair had been widely known for some years. In wearing Cora's clothes and jewels, Ethel was not embarrassed or constrained in her behavior by Cora's apparent departure and subsequent death. She exulted in it. She rejoiced in the freedom it had given her, and she didn't care at all what Cora's friends thought. What additional strain could a misplaced police inquiry place on them? Would it be sufficient to induce her to flee, thereby confirming police and public perceptions of their guilt? The only explanation for her flight with Crippen is that she was indeed guilty of some form of involvement in the murder. Subsequently, Ethel Le Neve never spoke about the events of 1910. She kept that affair quite secret, and no one seemed to have known who she was. Numerous reports which purported to tell her true story emerged in the years following, but they are contradictory and improbable, and it is doubtful she had anything to do with them. Crippen and she appeared to have formed a covenant before their arrest on the SS Montrose in July 1910, and they never broke that covenant. One of Crippen's first statements to the police was to insist that Ethel knew nothing of the matter. She maintained this too. While awaiting trial, Crippen sent a message to Ethel via his solicitors saying, "Tell Ethel not to worry. Tell her I will take all the blame." He did. Speculation abounds in this case. In the 109 years since the trial, theories good, bad, and even absurd compete to win the favour of a public which has never lost its fascination in the case. The whole truth may never be known, but taking in all the known facts and keeping speculation from the realms of fantasy, it seems likely that Ethel Le Neve got away with murder. Hawley Harvey Crippen was executed at 9 a.m. on the 23rd of November 1910 at Pentonville Jail. On that morning, Ethel Le Neve, now calling herself Ethel Allen, dressed in mourning black, and boarded the RMS Majestic, bound for New York. She travelled on to Toronto, where she worked as a typist for 3 years. In 1913, she returned to England to look after her sister, who was terminally ill. She changed her name to Ethel Harvey, somewhat poignantly, and she got a job at Hampton's furniture store near Trafalgar Square. In 1915, she married an accountant named Stanley Smith, and they lived in Croydon in South London. They had 2 children, Robert and Annie, who were called Bob and Nina. After her husband died in 1960, she moved for her final years to 62 Burford Road in Lewisham, where, in 1967, Ethel Clara Smith, previously known by the world as Ethel Le Neve, died in Dulwich Hospital of heart failure. She was 84 years old. In the 1980s, a crime writer, Jonathan Goodman, traced her son and daughter, who were then very elderly, and they were astonished to learn of their mother's background and past. They had never known anything of it, nor that she was the famous Ethel Le Neve who had been chased across the Atlantic by Inspector Dew of Scotland Yard 75 years earlier. Her silence and her secrets went with her to the grave. Hawley Harvey Crippen had never broken faith with her, and long after his death, nor had she with him.